Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new podcast, the second entry to the Reader Today podcast, the new podcast series that just started a couple of weeks ago when I interviewed Dave. Maybe you remember that. If you haven't seen that, or rather heard that, then please go ahead and check that out. The link is in the video description below. But today, we are going to have yet another guest who we will introduce in a couple of seconds. And I don't want to promise anything, but I'm pretty certain that today's conversation is going to be quite different from the last one. I think we are going to have a very different perspective on the topic than last time. I just wanted to say last week, but it definitely wasn't last week. I think it was sometime in December. But however, today we have another guest. Hello, Sascha. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks for having me. I am called Sascha, obviously. I also have a channel like Jeff, which goes by the name of SaschaFG.
Links in the video description below.
Yes, thank you. The last two letters actually come from my real name, which I won't go into detail now. But once I have my first book published, I might reveal a little bit more about those two letters.
You already heard that. Book published. There is going to be quite a different perspective on literature again. But before we come to that, we will definitely come back to that. I just wanted to ask you, how was your day or your week or whatever? How was your time? How are you doing?
Well, my day was quite relaxing in comparison to the previous week, which was a little bit exhausting to say the least. Maybe I need to explain a little bit for your listeners. I'm also a teacher, and I'm currently teaching 5th to 10th graders. Well, actually in this school year I only have 8th, 9th and 10th graders, but a couple of them. And during the past few days we had conferences, we had to do the gradings, we had talks with all kinds of different sorts of parents. And, well, yes, actually we did overtime. And to add to the whole amount of teaching hours, that was really exhausting. So I'm actually glad it's the weekend. And still, though, I took my time for Jeff.
Oh, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think it's a little similar, like on a stress level. Of course, I'm not yet a teacher, but I'm still in university for becoming that, and, currently, exam after exam, day by day, nothing but learning and doing tasks from the early morning till late night. Kind of exhausting as well. I actually had some kind of semi-burnout just a couple of weeks ago, and that combined with lots of visits with the doctors. Mm-hmm. Not a good time currently, but it's getting better now, which is why also we finally found a day to capture this podcast together.
So, there's a silver lining on the horizon, right?
There is.
Yes, but I know exactly how you feel. This November, this year, marks my 5th year since I have finished university. And I know that the last few semesters are nothing but stress.
Yeah.
And sorry to tell you this, but it will get harder once you enter the second teacher training phase.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But afterwards, when you have your routine and you have all the classes and students you're familiar with, then actually, even though you have to teach quite more than you did before, things will get better. I promise that.
Yeah, I'm positive about that, but the time until then is kind of freaking me out.
Yeah, you have to last through it.
Yeah,
there's a lot of stress going on in your psyche. I can tell you that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, actually, from many people, I often hear that university gets easier the further you get into it. Mm-hmm. And actually, this is the second time I'm visiting university. I studied another subject before going into teacher training, And there I really felt like the beginning was very hard, and once you got through the beginning, it actually became quite easier. Or, you know, it wasn't, it was, I don't know, you know, less modules,
Mm-hmm.
and you kind of got your time structured. But in teacher training, I feel like it's not getting less. It's really just getting more and more modules. And this semester I have a 70 credit point semester, while a regular semester would be like 30. So I'm basically studying 2.5 semesters at once, which is, well, quite stressful,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the exam phase. However, that is not the topic for today.
Yes. I
We are
think
talking,
we
yeah,
can even do a whole podcast on that subject for that matter, right?
absolutely. Yes, yes, absolutely. But today's actual topic is once again the reader today. So we want to explore how people are connected to literature nowadays, because it differs a lot. And we've already had a perspective on that last time, from someone who was rather, you know, literature was part of his life, but definitely not a main focus, and especially not like primary literature or fictional literature. I should rather say. Um, I'm pretty positive that that's going to be different today. So I just want to ask
In
you
a lot
straight
of ways.
ahead. Could you explain a little what role literature plays in your everyday life?
Oh, absolutely. Well, let me first of all think for a moment where to start. I'd say it has been a part of my life since around the last 20 years or so. It has also become part of my daily life, of my job as well, because before I said I'm a teacher, I haven't actually told your listeners what kind of teacher. I'm teaching English and German classes mainly. I also have additional subjects which I have also studied, because I also did two kind of studies before. Um, and due to the fact that I'm also a German teacher and an English teacher, we also do some lectures in classes. We also have different kind of works that we receive in classes that we work with. And I think during university times, I often was looking for some space where I could actually read on my own, where I could read actually a little bit fiction aside from all the non-fiction university had to force me through. And luckily, my train needed around 30 minutes to get me to university every day, and back also 30 minutes. So I had at least 1 hour of reading time each day, because I did not read for university while I was on the train. I read for my private stuff. And when I was at home, obviously, then that was the time where I focused on the non-fiction aspect of literature. However, I'd say I think I really became invested into literature around 12, 13 years old, when I was 12 or 13 years old.
That is so funny.
That's
But go ahead. I will elaborate on that
That is
from the beginning.
actually also a little bit part of my mother. She was also a little bit responsible for that. You know, when I think it has to be when I was 13 years old. I wasn't that good in English lessons, and she said, "Okay, we can do something about it. Here's this new book, which is called Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone." Which was actually kind of new, because only the first 4 books had been released around that time in Germany. However, she said, "You're going to read them in English, so it will help you improve a little bit." And as you can tell, it did. And short time after that, Lord of the Rings got released into cinema. And this is actually the jumpstart for me for my love for fantasy, right? Because I was watching the first movie before I have read the books, and there were a lot of things going on, which at first I did not understand, obviously, because I knew nothing about Tolkien, I knew nothing about the world itself. However, that kept me invested, that kept me going, and I think right around when Two Towers was released, I had already read halfway through the first 2 books. And yes, I kept going on and on and on. After I was done with Lord of the Rings, I was looking for other fantasy works and authors. That was around that time in Germany. There were a lot of fantasy books released focusing on all these kind of different fantasy races Tolkien used, such as the dwarves, the elves, and so on. But the first one I encountered was actually from a British novelist called Stan Nichols. He wrote about orcs, and I thought, hey, this is interesting. And now we're getting the bad guy side, right? Which actually turned out they were the anti-heroes of their own story, right? And after that,
in which text was that?
he released. I'm not quite sure what the books are actually called in English, because around that time I wasn't so good in English, so I have read it in German, obviously. Let me look it up. In German, they simply call his novel series The Orcs, but it's not actually the original name. Let me see.
Okay, while you look that up.
Legend of Thunder. Legend of Thunder and Bodyguards of Lightning. So,
okay, I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, and it's actually about a group of orcs and a dwarf actually that joined them as a mercenary, and they actually fight against their own fate, right? And even though I have to say, looking back at it, that the quality of the series declined after the second part, after the second book, this is also the one that made me actually look for similar authors in Germany. And around that time, a lot of books got published, and that is why my love for fantasy even grew more. And then I started going back to the classics as well. And when I reached university, and because I just finished school, I was also interested to read a lot of the classics from German literature, English literature, also from French literature and Russian literature.
Okay, I have to stop you right now.
Okay, sorry, I could go on and on.
We're covering 1,000 topics right now.
Yes, I could go on and on. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
you have to signalize me if it's too much.
Sure, no problem, no problem. What I wanted to say, what I thought was quite funny, I've also mentioned that in the first episode of this podcast series, was when you said that your love for literature started when you were around like 12 or 13 years old, because that's so funny to me, because I was actually reading a lot before that time. Sometimes on my own, sometimes together with my mother, who also read, for example, Harry Potter, I think 5 and 6 to me, if I'm not mistaken. However, when I was around 11 or 12 years old, I actually stopped reading completely for another almost 10 years. So actually, when I entered puberty, I absolutely couldn't enjoy reading anymore, and then just started reading again when I was going to university. Because actually, I have to be honest, when I decided I want to become a teacher, I completely forgot that literature was a part of that. I really became a teacher for the language reasons, or wanted to become a teacher for that reason. And then I realized, oh Jesus, I have to know about literature. And then there was this one professor, and he was so amazing that he really, made me like reading again. But I had this break of 10 years that started around that time that you started reading a lot. That's what I think is quite funny.
Yeah, actually, I have read before the age of 12 or 13 as well, but only rarely. And usually I was listening to my grandmother, actually, because she had a huge love for fairy tales.
Ah. Okay,
so I was also already kind of on the verge of becoming interested in fantasy-like stories.
Fantasy stories. You mentioned that a lot now. That sounds to me like this is somehow your favorite genre of novels, I guess.
This one and obviously the other side of the spectrum, sci-fi.
Okay, yeah. Those are especially well when combined. I think sci-fi, fantasy, very amazing stuff. Now, within this genre of fantasy, would you say you have an actual favorite novel? One, if you were to name only one favorite fantasy novel.
Yeah, obviously that would be The Return of the King by Tolkien, because
Okay.
that is actually my jumpstart, right, for the whole thing. That took everything I did afterwards. This is actually where I would point it out and say, okay, this is actually my jumpstart. Everything that followed was a consequence by
Oh,
that.
that's very interesting. I have these Lord of the Rings novels here. Actually, I haven't read them yet, but I will. And a friend was here 2 days ago, whom I will going on a road trip with in a couple of months, if the current situation allows that. And we were discussing which books I should read on this road trip. And he was like, "You haven't read The Lord of the Rings? Return of the King is my favorite book of all time." So it's funny that you said the same thing.
What a
right now.
coincidence!
Yeah, just like 2 days ago.
But here's the thing, though. Even though Tolkien is actually considered to be the grandfather, the godfather of fantasy, so to speak, right? His intention wasn't actually to write an entertaining book, because he was, as you probably know,
Yes,
a professor for language, and
I
actually,
have a book of
yes,
him here, like
Yeah.
a language book.
Yeah,
His interpretation, analyzation.
yes, there is
of
a
Beowulf.
lot of things he did actually on the non-fictional side, and actually he tried to kind of make up a story around the Elven language, and therefore from an pure entertaining author perspective, he's actually the best author that is out there, right? Oh, we have to wait for the authorities.
Go ahead.
Okay, so however, he laid the foundation for everything that came afterwards. Obviously, there were some other classics, other authors who kind of wrote around the same time, or let's say 1 or 2 decades after him, right? But it took quite a long time for these authors to either be recognized or their works to be considered classics
Yeah,
in the
I
fantasy
agree.
genre itself. For example, nowadays everyone has at least heard the name George R. R. Martin before, right? But the interest, the public interest in Game of Thrones, came because of Tolkien's works and their adaptation.
Yeah, I would also say the same thing about The Witcher.
Obviously,
When the games really are more popular than the actual books, even though I think the books are very good.
I think the books are actually sometimes far superior. Even though I'd say the game Witcher 3 is one of my top 10 favorite games
Yes,
to play.
absolutely. Very amazing game. It's too sad that the author doesn't like it and the
Yeah,
story.
but he's a kind of stingy when it comes to his view, considering all the adaptation of its work. He said it's
Yeah.
their own world, and I have my world, and everything I have written is canon, and or like people like to call it, it's the word of God, right? So it's actually a common trope, and it's called already a word of God. And he said,
I
okay,
understand that.
you do that on your own.
Yeah, and I understand that. Like, if I don't know, sometime, no, I forgot what I wanted to say. Right, if someone came to me and asked me, yeah, can I do, I don't know, a TV series about your Backfire series, but not the story in your books, but like another story, and I was like, yeah, okay, go ahead, but I wouldn't have a say in it, and they would
Yeah,
just do it,
obviously.
and then I would realize, oh, but no, So I understand how he might feel about that.
Yeah,
Now,
because
back
it's
to
only
the-
based on it, right?
Right. Yes.
Then
back
we
to
would
the
have-
fantasy genre.
Yeah.
There's one more question I have about that. You have talked about what you would consider like your what started at your kind of favorite fantasy book. Have you also read a high fantasy novel that you would consider like the worst you've read, the worst fantasy work that you have read, or
Yeah.
or one that you just didn't enjoy?
Actually, as I mentioned before, the first whole series I have read after Lord of the Rings was by Stan Nichols, and I have to say, actually, everything that came after the second part is, sorry, he did a brilliant world building with his very first novel, but after the second one, it got so terrible. He he actually wrote like this: there's one fight scene after another fight scene after another fight scene with almost no story whatsoever, and
Okay.
it's as if he forgot how to write good books, right? And I also have to be honest with you, I didn't really enjoy the first two Aragon books as well.
Okay, I haven't read them as well.
I think nowadays Christopher Paolini is a really brilliant author. I have read his newest work, which was Sleep in a Field of Stars, or something like that is it called, which is a sci-fi novel. But I think his early days weren't that good.
Okay. But they were very popular, right?
Yeah, they were popular because they were also at the released at the right time, basically. Yes, when the whole public got interested in the genre, and then they were looking for some authors to pick from.
Yeah. Now, before we leave this topic, because I want to speak about something else than fantasy novels as well. But I've been thinking about something right now. Those fantasy novels you just mentioned, those aren't too recent. Do you have perhaps a recommendation of a rather recent fantasy novel?
Yeah, actually, I have two. I bought two books that got released last year. Um, none. I have to tell you this. Both are in German because there is no English translation as of yet.
Oh,
Sadly, I think one of the more recent ones I'd go with everything released by Brandon Sanderson, probably. His Stormlight archive is very recent, actually. I think the latest was released in 2019. I'm also very interested in Robin Hobb's works, and she ended the Life Trader series, the Farseer series. There are a couple of trilogies. I think the latest was also released in 2018, 2017, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, I do also enjoy recent books. However, there's a recent trend which I am not very fond of, and
which is?
actually nowadays it seemed as people try to get away from the classical high fantasy style, and which is okay actually, but now it felt rather forced, right? So I'd say 10 years ago that was very fine by me, because there was a lot of Tolkien clones out there, but nowadays it feels so forced because everyone tries to tiptoe around using dwarves, orcs, or all the other races. If you're lucky, you get at least some magicians. Oh, I'm sorry, my throat.
You want to drink some water?
I need to drink a little bit more. Maybe you need to cut out my coughing. Where was I? Nowadays they try to avoid actually all the traditional stuff, and only try to focus on human conflicts, which is fine by me. But I need more aside from that, because if I want to see how humans argue, I could look into politics and have the same results, right?
Probably, yeah.
Probably. So if you're lucky, you will see some magicians in some recent works and some dragons, but that's actually where the fantasy part stops, which I think is sad. We need to find the right balance between traditional and modern fantasy style. That's probably the reason why I'm also have become a huge fan of Neil Gaiman's works. And he re-released American Gods, I think 3 or 4 years ago. I have read the original in 2010 and his director's cut, which has been released 4 years ago. And it's really interesting his approach to fantasy.
Okay. Very, very interesting. What you said so far. That was heavy focus on fantasy books. Now we will go away from that in a couple of seconds. I just want to say that I personally am not too much into fantasy as a, like this high fantasy as a genre of novels. I actually enjoy high fantasy, especially when I think about video games. However, in novels, I personally look for something else, especially since high fantasy novels are mostly quite thick.
Yes, obviously.
And I personally prefer books who are around like 200, 300 pages, because I prefer reading more stories in a shorter time than, having one book that keeps me going for a couple of months. I don't know why this is so different to video games, because in video games I prefer those who keep me going for 100 hours. But in books, I really prefer the short ones. And I personally do not know about many short, or rather short, high fantasy novels. But yeah, that has to do with something that I also talked about in the podcast that I released in early February, when I said that I read very slowly. I read very, very slowly. And I think if I were to start a book that has like 1,000 pages now, it would take me 2 years or so to finish it, which is very sad because I could read so many other books in that time. But for someone who reads a lot and is capable of reading fast as well, I think those are very good. And I personally just prefer than, movie adaptations or so. But that does not mean that I don't like the fantasy genre or the high fantasy genre. Not at all. That doesn't mean that. I just, reasons I just said. However, there are so many other genres out there.
I'm not only reading high fantasy novels,
no, of
even
course,
though
of course,
it's one of my favorite ones. Yeah,
yes,
I just need to make this clear, right? There are also other subparts of fantasy which I started reading, such as heroic fantasy, sword and sorcery, for example, David Gemmell.
Yeah.
I think David Gemmell is something you might probably enjoy. Sadly, he isn't alive anymore, but he wrote a really interesting series about an so to speak anti-hero, and from the length of it, these also look like novellas actually. So I think this might be something you might enjoy. Right?
What's the name of the series?
I'm so sorry, because it has been over 10 years or so that I have read his books. I need to look it up, right?
No
I might look things up during the podcast.
That's okay.
It's okay. Also, I also started enjoying horror and thriller literature a lot. And Stephen King has become one of my favorite authors over time. And he actually, what's interesting for me is he wrote the Dark Tower series, which is actually a hybrid between horror and fantasy. And also these books are actually rather short. So I think that has also to do with high fantasy itself, that you have to have big books because you do a lot of world building, right?
Yes.
And usually
absolutely.
it takes around 200 pages for the story actually to set off.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the big difference for when you for example, just, write a romantic story set in the 2020s, then you don't have to explain the world because the readers know the world. If it's just set like in modern day London or whatever. So yeah, definitely fantasy as well as sci-fi. Dune as well are very thick books.
Obviously, yes.
Sci-fi, fantasy, and they just need that much world building. It's very necessary. However, I personally, I wouldn't say that I have a favorite genre, but I can definitely say I have a favorite, let's say, time span of like a literary period of when novels release, and that is from the British perspective, Victorianism. There were so many great books. I'm also a huge fan of the Sherlock Holmes series. I think I'm generally a huge fan of crimes. However, what is your opinion on other genres? Are there other genres that you personally don't enjoy, or are there non-sci-fi fantasy genres that you also really enjoy a lot? You just mentioned horror as well.
Yes. Horror and mystery. Sometimes a little bit thriller. Last year, I got introduced by a friend of mine, which I also know from YouTube, into the series called I Am the Night by Ethan Cross, which is a crime and thriller series. And it's told from two perspectives, from a detective and from a serial killer's perspective, right?
Okay.
And without spoiling it further ahead, it really gets you going, right? And it's so exciting to read. So a genre I really enjoy as well is is actually kind of like a subgenre. It's called Whodunit.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I love these
very
kind
amazing.
of books, especially Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot. I have become a huge fan. I can't count actually how often I have read and have watched Murder on the Orient Express. And I'm looking forward actually to see Death on the Nile next week.
Yes, me too.
It has been released in Germany. It has been released 2 days ago, but due to my very stressful week, I could not go to the cinema yet.
Yes,
but,
I will go on Monday, I think.
So I really like these detective stories as well, and I'm a huge fan of Hercule Poirot as well, because I like his dandyism and his behavioristics, right?
That's nice to hear.
Sometimes I also read comedy books as well. There's a German series which I was introduced to by a mutual friend of Jeff and mine. Rick has introduced me to the Kangaroo Chronicles, which was really hilarious to read. Sometimes I read aside from fantasy, and so I also like the classics as well. I think Victorian era is where you wanted to get for. Yeah, I really like the Victorian era as well, but I also like to go back to previous genres. What's interesting, I actually have read quite a lot of English romance novelists such as Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters. However, I can't stand German romance novels. I simply can't stand, and I can't stand anything that is too sex-driven either in novels, because that is actually for me a huge turn off. I want to focus on the story as well. I know that for some fictitious works that's mandatory to have at least one or two of these scenes, but if the novel is overloaded with it, that's actually where I put it down. And coming back to what I just said, I prefer English romance novelists over the German ones as well, is also a little bit part of what kind of teacher I had in school, because school made me really hate. Sorry to say that for every German classic fan, but I really started to hate every work by Theodor Fontane. And I can't stand his writing style.
That's for me with Schiller.
Okay.
I have this feeling for Schiller.
Schiller, I can swallow at times, right? But Theodor Fontane is really a burden for me. It has become a burden. I really like the classics as well. From time to time, I pick a classic book. What's good is I have subscribed to an ebook service 2 or 3 years ago, and they put classic books also into the libraries as well nowadays, because some are really hard to get, right? And from time to time I look, this is from the canon literature, actually, what you have to have read once in your lifetime. And sometimes I sit down and read these books as well, right? This is actually why I found my second love for classical Russian literature, even though these stories are often so depressing, right?
I'm not sure if I've read any of these, except for those, how's it called? those kind of fairy tales,
But I'm pretty sure you have heard about War and Peace, right?
Yes.
By Tolstoy, right?
Yeah,
I have read that. I am actually a fast reader. Sometimes I read around 3 to 5 books at once, also because of school. Yes, but War and Peace, even though I enjoyed it, it took me some time to finish.
Yeah, okay. How long was it? Like in pages, roundabout?
I think I have read the ebook version, which was around 1,200 pages or so, and I think the printout version is almost twice as long, the German translation, to say the least.
Wow, that is hard.
That is hard.
That brings me to one of 2 questions that I want to ask you right now. The first is, we have spoken about some of the English classics now, some of the German classics, also Russian classics. Which is your preferred language in reading?
Actually, both in English are equal for me. Funny thing, school made me hate Theodor Fontane, but school made me love Shakespeare's works. And my favorite play by him is actually Macbeth. For obvious reasons, there are also fantasy elements into it, right? And it's a lot of bloodbath going on, actually. Yeah. I know you were almost vomiting.
Yeah, sorry. I've only read
he's
2 Shakespeare novels or plays, and I disliked both of them. Those were Hamlet and Midsummer Night's Dream.
Okay, Midsummer Night's Dream I think was also for me hard to swallow because I'm not that fond of romance stuff, right? But Hamlet, I actually find it quite entertaining.
Okay.
I also school made me love Goethe's works when it comes to German literature.
Yeah.
And that's why I'd say I love both languages on an equal level. I'd like to read more in French as well, but my French got a little bit rusty.
Yeah.
I have started reading Le Count de Monte Cristo in original language, but
I think I also have this in French in my
yeah, but I needed to pick the translation up as well because even though I am very familiar with the story, I have read it before, I have read the German version before, I have seen a couple of adaptations. I wanted to read the French version, but I need to practice my French again because it has been almost 10 years since I have actively used that language, right? And so it got kind of rusty.
Yes, of course. That happens to language.
Yes.
Especially we as either English teachers or upcoming English teachers have a special relation to rustiness of language because we don't want our students' English to rust. But very interesting answer. I think for me it's a little similar. Like I personally also, same goes with video games, music, and movies. I always prefer the original, obviously. Like I personally would never, for example, read a German translation of Hamlet or of William Golding's Lord of the Flies. Like when it originally was English, I have to read it in English. But of course, I would not read, I don't know, Nathan der Weise as an English translation. That wouldn't make any sense to me.
Here's the fun thing, though.
Yeah.
I once read Faust in English, and
Okay.
that was overcomplicated, right?
Okay.
That was even worse to read than actually Macbeth. When I have read Macbeth the first time, I did not understand any word, even though I'm a native German speaker. Yes, and I had to struggle to get through the translated version. But same thing actually happened to me during university times. When I was reading a non-fiction work for university, and I found out this is actually a German translation from English, then obviously I went to the English library to get the original one because sometimes the translated versions are far inferior to the original versions. Sometimes
Do you have an example?
Yes. For example, in the introduction phase, I had to read a text by Terry Eagleton on what is literature in general. He's really famous for literature studies, right? And because I have also studied German, I have faced his text twice. First in the English studies, and then in the German studies. However, in the German studies, I had to read his translated works. And I was looking at it and I said, oh my gosh, are you really? Are you real? I can't sit through this text. So I went to the English library. I borrowed the English version. I read the English version. I summarized it in German. And I was prepared for the next seminar.
Yeah.
The semester afterwards, I got to read the text for English studies again, but it was already saved up here, so I was really prepared.
Nice. I have another question about the classics. Let's define classics by, well, for this purpose, let's say everything up to including modernism. So let's say everything before postmodernism, if we were looking at it from a British literary perspective. once again, same with that we had with high fantasy novels. If you had to pick one classic as your favorite from this huge time span, which would you consider?
Obviously, for German, I would go with Faust, and also part 2, because I have a love for the Sturm und Drang period, and for Goethe, obviously.
And for English?
For English, that would probably be The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Oh, I haven't read this, but I have to.
Because I am such a big fan of Oscar Wilde, and I have enjoyed reading this book also during my finals in school, and I have had to read it again during university times. And I also did a whole presentation on the novel, and yes, it kept me going. I was so invested into it, right? I could sometimes, if you're really invested in a story, you could actually see the characters coming to you live right in front of your eyes, right? And that happened to me with The Picture of Dorian Gray. And fun fact is, it was only afterwards I found out that there are several adaptations that exist, and then I already started watching them. But I have not watched any adaptation during university times by that book.
Yeah. I also started watching some movie adaptations of books, but always just after I read the book, because it's so very, very different, and most of the time just worse
yes,
than reading the book.
Obviously,
yeah,
because sometimes our brain has a different perspective, different images.
Yes,
obviously, how we imagine the world. That we read about, how it works, how the character looks, interacts with each other. And then if we're watching adaptations, we kind of have to sit actually and take in a forced perspective by the person who made the adaptation, which sometimes can be really good, yes, but sometimes it can be worse. In rare cases, I have found examples where the movie was superior to the book. But that's really rare, because in most cases,
I'm thinking of if I can come up with one now.
I know one. It was originally written in Dutch language, and I'm not quite sure what the English translation is. The German version is called Der 100-Jährige, der aus dem Fenster stieg und verschwand.
So and the 100 years old person that got out of the window.
I'm not quite sure if they used that as a translated title. However, I have to say that the movie is far superior compared to the book, because I could not get through the book as fast as I wished to, because the pacing is so off charts. It takes quite a long time for the story to evolve.
But you have read a translated version, right?
I have read the translated version, obviously, because of language reasons. But I gave it a go in 2 translated versions. I read the German version, and I tried to read into the English version, and found out that the pacing is the same. So it's not the translator's fault. It's actually the original author's fault, because everything drags on and on and on and on and on, right?
I just recently read a book, I think it's also quite popular, by Dave Eggers, called The Circle. That's a...
I know The Circle.
Yeah, okay. Just for the listeners, that's a semi-dystopian sci-fi novel, I would say, and an okay-ish book. And after I read it, I also watched the movie, which is with Emma Watson and Tom Hanks. And I was like, Emma Watson and Tom Hanks sounds like it's going to be a great adaptation. And it was one of the worst adaptations I've ever seen. It was a terrible movie, I have to say, especially after reading the book. But however, let's get to yet another completely different topic. We have been talking about lots of classics in the past couple of minutes. And during these times, when the classics arrived, when they released, the book had a very different role in society than today, I would say. And nowadays, people actually say novels become extinct, like reading becomes a rarity. And I would like to ask you, how would you react to that?
Well, I would say in general I can't 100% agree, but I can't disagree neither.
Yeah.
Because from a teacher's point of view, obviously, this is sadly the case, which I have noticed year after year. There are less students who are willingly to read something on the private part, on the privacy. However, on the other hand, though, I'd say that the book market, especially in Germany, often tries to find new ways to grow. And I can't, as I said before, I can't 100% agree and I can't disagree neither. I think there's a shift, however, and actually, I think reading in traditional ways, such as with a print version, that is something that has become actually rarer over the past few years, because there are a lot of different ways nowadays on how to access ebooks, print on demand, for example, self-publishing. It even has to do with all the publishers, right? There's a huge market out there nowadays for self-publishers.
Yeah.
If you compare it with how it is nowadays to, let's say, in the last 10 or 20 years or so,
Yeah.
and I think that is actually also a little bit responsible on how we actually perceive and how we read books, right? What I found actually interesting is actually the interaction between other kind of media, let's say Netflix, for example, and books. Whenever Netflix actually gets the right to adapt a new book, then that book actually has a huge new amount of readers.
Yes.
To give you an example, when The Witcher season 1 got released, right? Many
Yeah.
books, many libraries went out of print for the first 2 Witcher books,
Yeah.
right? It took them, I think, 3 or 4 months until it was available again. So I think there's a lot of shift going on, and the interaction between all kind of medias. But I wouldn't say 100% well, there are less readers. It's actually the way how we get to literature and how we work with it has changed.
Yeah, I agree. I agree on that. What you just said about The Witcher, that's funny because I also bought the first Witcher book after watching the first season of the Witcher series on Netflix. And same with Dune. I bought the book after watching the movie. So yeah, that definitely happens a lot today, I think. And yeah, I would also agree that it doesn't become extinct. I think reading will never become extinct, actually, even though there are some people who actually say that. But yeah, I still think readers, well, the amount of readers are getting less and less. I just recently had a look at some statistics. I cannot recall the source. I'm sorry, but it said like only around 20% of people are still very actively reading, which I think is really not a lot. And I'm not sure how how reliable the source was, and what the circumstances were that they made these statistics. But 20% of all people reading is well, it's not a lot compared to couple of years ago or a couple of decades ago. And this is also, I think, something important for the both of us, because we're both writing novels in our free time, right? You are an author yourself.
Yes.
Would you like to elaborate on that a little?
Yes, actually, I have not released any kind of written word yet, because I'm still working on a couple of projects at the same time, actually, I have to say. I have finished my very first novel, which I am reworking on a little bit for the third or fourth time now, because obviously it is a high fantasy work and there is a lot of pages to go through. but yeah, I think this also kind of affects us both, and I still though I intend to release actually all of my projects in the near future. I have yet to wait for a response from a publisher I have sent an expose to. They said it will take around 3 months, so we're halfway through. I have to wait six more weeks, actually almost 7. And then there's a short story competition where I'm currently working on. The release, actually, no, not the release. The deadline is on the 28th of February. And actually, I'm done with my short story. I'm just reworking also on it. I'm going over it again.
Yeah.
And then, well, I will talk about that in the future, or probably on my channel as well. So I'm looking forward to it. The reason why I said I am working actually on several projects at once, here's the thing. Whenever I'm writing on my fantasy stories, sometimes I have ideas I think might be interesting to make up yet another story, but they don't fit within the same genre. So I need to write them down. Maybe I also started writing the prologue because I actually have planned everything out before I started writing any word. Whenever I start writing a new project, I first of all I write down the prologue and then I write down the epilogue, because I want to know how the story starts and I also want to know how it ends, right?
Okay.
Because, well, I actually hate spoilers, but I can't spoil myself, right? So
Yeah, right.
to get it out of the window. But I want to know how the journey ends, and for me, what's interesting is actually everything in between. How many plot twists I put in, how do the characters face each other, how do they work together or don't work together actually. And sometimes I have I say interesting ideas. I wouldn't call them brilliant as of yet. That is up to my future readers to decide if they are brilliant or not. But I'd say they are interesting enough to write them down, but they don't really fit within the genre. For example, one time I had an idea for a story that included time traveling, which does not make sense in sci-fi, in a high fantasy. Maybe a little bit. It could, but not in a traditional thinking. Like when it comes to stories such as "The Man Who Folded Himself," which is actually a book I'm currently reading, and or for more movie fans, Back to the Future, right? Which is also one of the classics when it comes to time traveling stories. And this is actually a movie trilogy I have to watch at least once a year because I so love it. I love it so much.
Yeah. I think I've never seen the third one though. Whoops.
Whoopsie daisy.
Yeah.
I haven't heard that one.
Okay. Okay. So that's very interesting. I feel you in that regard. I also only start really writing a script after planning out everything. I don't write the epilogue down right after the prologue, but I have quite some room behind me. You can see it. My room is not too small, and I tend to play lots of scenes like as if I was in a theater. Like I act these things out for me over and over again. And especially when I think about Backfire has just started. The story is still at the beginning, but I constantly, like almost on a daily basis, I play the final scenes, like the last 2 or 3 chapters. I play them over and over again, refine them, especially combined with the new ideas that I had for the time in between. Because the ending has to be clear. I think when you start writing a script, you have to know where you're going. So I definitely feel you there and agree. And I'm very excited to one day read something out of your fingers that is not a WhatsApp message, but a novel. And I will definitely, of course, I will also feature that on this channel as well.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, I'm also looking forward to it. And with that, I think we have had quite a nice discussion about literature, about reading,
Mm-hmm.
about lots of books and novels. And it's up for you to come up with something. You will have time for like 2 or 3 minutes of a monologue now, because I will prepare something for you as a final thing. I always want to do in this podcast series. I first of all have to ask you for a number from 1 to 26. Now that sounds like I'm gonna choose, like you're gonna choose a letter, but you aren't, because it's decoded.
Mm-hmm.
So a number from 1 to 26. Then I give you time for some monologues, something else you want to talk about, and then I'll be back for the finale.
Okay, then the number obviously would be number 9, because there were 9 fellowships who had to bring the ring to Mordor.
That's great closing. Very, very great. Okay, so I will be back in like 3 minutes, and I want you to talk about something else that you still have on your mind.
And it can be anything, right?
Should be related to reading and literature, but yes.
Yes, okay, so I will read your, I will leak your address. No, I'm kidding. Okay, well, maybe I will do a little bit monologue on all my projects a little bit, because you said I need to elaborate, and I think if I keep talking about it in detail, it would obviously be much, much longer than for... we have time left actually for this podcast. Yes, I have talked about that I'm currently writing several projects at once. I would maybe go a little bit over them quickly, and then have my take for you listeners on literature and reading on your free time. So, the short story I'm currently writing on is like a crime detective story, something I have never ever written before, which is actually my first steps in that genre. And I'm actually kind of curious how it turns out. The only thing I did here for the story is that I actually wrote down who is the culprit, but I am not sure how the rest will play out. The fantasy series I am actually working on is part of a bigger series I am planning, and it will also include the typical Tolkien-esque races, but also new made-up ones. And I have also incorporated something like a parallel universe, much like in Norse mythology. And the other series I'm working on is actually a time travel sci-fi series, which is actually a little bit complicated, because whenever characters meet each other again in different eras and periods, I have to pay close attention, because I'm using the butterfly effect for the whole story. So it's complicated, and sometimes I'm reworking the whole scene over and over and over again. Okay, do I have more time left, or shall I end it now?
I would say thank you.
Yes, yes.
Of course, if there's still something
Nah,
to say, just go
I
ahead.
could simply say, if you're more interested on my takes and everything I am talking about, feel free to come over to my channel. However, we want it's German. Maybe I might do an English version in the future. I don't know yet, because I'm also writing in German. I'm not translating my works yet, even though I could, but well, I don't have the time on my hands. And maybe someone more professional can do that. But
Perhaps, yes.
you could always look out, and maybe if you're interested in learning a little bit more about literature in German, feel free to come over to my channel, right?
Right, you should definitely do that. As I said before, the links are in the video description below, both to his literature channel, his German gaming channel, as well as his English gaming channel.
And I also have 2 podcasts.
Also 2 podcasts. I think I'm just going to link everything down below you can find. Perhaps I'm just going to open up a link tree for that. And
so, and then I will use your links, and then I don't have to come up with my own link tree.
Right. And yeah, so even though it's German and you might perhaps be English listeners, don't worry if you don't understand anything of the German stuff. Still go ahead, share some support. And if you don't understand it, then don't worry. I will definitely make a English video about it once it has been released. Okay, so the final game that I always play, or always plan on playing in these podcasts, also did that in the first episode, is that you basically choose a letter without choosing a letter. Like I mixed all the numbers for the letters in a list, and now you said 9. Obviously 9 would be A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I would be I. Now, however, the 9 in this decoded list for you was the letter S.
So quite fitting, actually.
Yeah, right.
Because of my name.
Yes. So I went over to my bookshelf and had a look at all the books that I have for authors with the name S, either as first names or surnames. And I thought about what would I like to recommend to you today.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I think it was quite difficult because obviously, S is filled heavily filled with Shakespeare, for example. Things you might already know, or things I know you would definitely like or dislike. And I came up with something which I'm absolutely not sure if you would like it or not. It's by an author. She's called Muriel Spark. So there's the S.
I have heard her name before, but I'm not sure if I have read anything by her.
And the book is one that I personally enjoyed. It is called The Prime of Miss Jean Brody. And why I think it would be, or it could be interesting for you to read is that, I wouldn't say it's a classic, but it's definitely a little older. I'm not sure, sometime in the 20th century. And it is actually about, a teacher in her prime. And there are some interesting things going on, and I personally liked it, but I also know many people who disliked this book. So it's very short. I think it's a very small book and only like 100 pages long. So definitely a quick reader. And I think you might enjoy it, perhaps, but I would definitely be very interested in your opinion about it.
Okay. So I have looked up the book. Yes. Sounds interesting. I might check it out in the future, and then
Great.
I will probably do a review on my channel.
That's great.
Because each book I'm going to read from now on will have had at least one review on my channel, maybe more videos to add to the content.
Yeah, great. So thank you very much for being part of this podcast.
You're
I
welcome.
think we've come to quite some interesting topics and thoughts here. As I said before, this podcast is really just analyzing reading behavior, so it's not just talking about problematic topics. I will definitely have some other podcast series as well, so I think it's quite certain that we will meet again on this channel.
I'm pretty sure we will.
Yeah.
I also kept my promise because I have looked up David Gemmell series for you, because I said I recommend a book to you as well, so then we are on an even level. It's simply called Legend. Legend. As in The Legend of Zelda, for example.
Yes.
So simply Legend. And I think this might be something you might enjoy for someone who actually likes to read shorter books, right? But wants to give the fantasy genre a go.
Yes, definitely.
It's not your typical. It's not.
Much.
You're welcome. It's not your typical high fantasy. It's more or less a sword and sorcery, meaning it's more focused on an individual overcoming all the challenges and burdens in his life. But it's really worth it.
Okay, I will definitely give it a try.
Yeah,
I will look it up right after the podcast. So,
and then I'm curious about your opinion on it.
Okay. You will hear about, definitely. It might also take some time.
Yeah, it's okay.
Because I still have to read lots of books for university. But
I know that feel.
Yeah. So, and with that, I want to stop this podcast. Thank you very much out there for listening. Once again, I really want to ask you for your opinions. Just have a look down below. There's a comment section. Maybe you've heard of that. So just go ahead. If you had any thoughts about what we spoke about, then put it down there. I would really, really love some interaction. And I think also Sascha here would have a look down there to perhaps answer your questions.
Yes.
So thank you very much, and see you next week. And goodbye, Sascha.
Bye.